So we'll start by having a discussion, but before we do that, I have some specific questions to specific presenters. And the first one is for Sarah Crosby. And the question is that how many human participants do you have in your study?
We have two different studies. For the copy study that we have used, the old data set, we had 779 person tested. And for the UBC study that we have, like the recent study, we had 150.
Okay. That's really good. And I think the next one is to Dr. Kane, and the first one is from the floor, not from me. I have one or two from me. What variables did you feed into your predictive models, decision tree, ANN, etc.?
Yeah, so I think that this figure here, I just shared my screen. So just shows that I think there were 30 some variables split between contextual and personal. So the contextual ones are kind of the obvious humidity, set point changes, or current and past set point, indoor, outdoor temperatures. We have access to occupancy sensor data. That as well, and then what season it is and what the previous event is. So the data that I showed isn't just demand response changes, it's every automated set point change. So a lot of these are scheduled changes, or maybe changes due to some sort of smart recovery period. On the personal factors, we kind of took an initial shot at this. There's definitely room to improve what sort of personal factors we used, but we considered the average day of the week that the occupant overrides, the time of day of the average time of day of this person's overrides. Are they more likely to increase or decrease the set points during cooling seasons? And sometimes we found that there's actually kind of two different types of behaviors. Occupants sometimes will essentially override immediately, as if they were able to predict a scheduled change. And I'll even notice this at home. I can hear the thermostat click, and then I'll get up and go override it. So there's some that are doing it instantly, and then some that do it over more of what we would expect of the room temperature changes, and they become uncomfortable. So we try to kind of classify those two different cases for that person. And then those are fed into the different models. So thanks for the opportunity to explain that more.
Okay, so you mentioned in your presentation that you have 100,000 thermostats that you looked at.
Yep.
And are these around the world, or are they in the US?
Around the world, but primarily in the US. I would say just spitballing, about 70% of them are probably in the US.
So how did you account for environmental conditions in this range of areas? For example, weather conditions and various geographical locations.
So we did consider both, we classified it by seasons. So all analysis was separated by heating and cooling seasons. That behavior would be different in each one of those. And then we considered outdoor temperature and kind of the everything that we could have imagined we sensed. We didn't specifically separate the analysis yet, at least by climate zone. But that's definitely an opportunity for further analysis.
Okay, I'll put a question here again back to Sarah Crosby from Carol Pendersky. Could you repeat what was the difference between the two databases, methodology of data collection as well?
Yeah. So like the main difference between the two methodologies, we try to repeat and follow the same methodology. The main difference between the two data sets are that the first one is old. It's 17 years old. So that was the main purpose of repeating it, to have a recent data set. Our data set is only in Canada. The first one is across Canada and the US. We try to have like variation in the seasons. So we collected some data in spring and summer and winter, and we're planning to collect more in fall. The first one was mainly in summer and spring times. But in terms of methodologies, like data collection.
You want to turn your camera on, Sarah?
Excuse
Can
me?
you turn your camera on if you want, or just carry on, please?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. So you're saying about the different data sets.
Yeah, so in terms of data collection, we try to follow the same methodology as much as we can. So we collected IEQ data from each workstation like they did. We try to use the same sensors, but we couldn't use the same exact sensor that they had.
Okay. So we have a question here for Simona. Simona, the question is, when using ICT to change behavior, how do you think the behavior change recommendation should be generated? Is it the computational algorithm behind these recommendations or something else?
Yeah, so at least what we are experiencing in our tool, the way we're providing behavioral change suggestions to the users is through gamification. So we're trying to use these gamified features that are contextual, of course. So we do have a full deployed sensor networks in the homes that we want to use as experiment. And when we provide feedback, for instance, more tailored information, we try to keep them as targeted as possible. So also in terms of providing actionable suggestions just when the users are, for instance, interacting with that specific control system, try to be realistic as much as possible. So don't ask to, for instance, open a window if it's not reachable at all, and of course being as timely as possible. There is for us the biggest challenge in being timely when you want to develop a real-time feedback system to create behavioral change through games. Which we know it's very effective, but of course it deals with a lot of barriers in terms of time and technology. Yeah.
Okay, there's also a following question to you from Andreas Wagner. The question is, are you also planning to give people the opportunity to interfere if they are feeling uncomfortable with your settings?
To give people possibility to interfere, what does it mean?
To change the settings.
Okay. Well, if the question is related to the experimental settings in the office, in our case, no. For the moment, we don't want them to interfere with the temperature training and with the lighting. So for the moment, we're keeping the experimental stable. So we want to get as much feedback as possible by keeping a control sample. And then by providing them the opportunity to provide just feedback, not a possibility to have actions, we want to tailor the curve of the temperature settings accordingly, and then reevaluating their feedback after.
Do you think that is a representative of the actual situation if you don't give them an override?
Well, that's a key point. For the moment, we want to try to have a stable building management system to understand which are the limits. The second stage will be eventually giving them the possibility to, for instance, coming back to a fixed temperature during the whole day. But now our goal of the experiment is to test the hypothesis that this temperature training automatically generated by the building management system is indeed more effective in terms of satisfaction and productivity.
Okay, Filippo, I've got a question to you. I know it's a very short presentation. What are the future plans for the work? How are you going to take it forward?
First of all, for sure, we need to validate the means of virtual reality in a way that is integrated with other methodology of monitoring the reliability of the instruments. And if it works, we want to find other triggers able to give placebo stimuli to the subjects.
For Yemen again, the same question. I know you had a lot of modeling that you're doing in your presentation. So where does it go to practical outcomes?
Sorry, Professor, you were muted at the start there. Could you just re-say that question?
Hello, Yemen. Did you hear the question, or shall I repeat it?
This is for me?
Yes.
Oh,
so,
I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, so the question is, you have shown so many future plans for modeling and data analysis. How would that be taken forward to a practical applications, let's say in offices and things like that?
Yeah. So I think at this moment, though, the focus is still very much on the comparison between IV and the in situ in order to ensure that we find ways and parameters that we use measuring human building interaction, the IVE, are reliable in situ scenario. So that is the first step. Based on this initial study, we probably have more confidence than before, at least I have more confidence than before, that if we well control the virtual environment, it could be a very good environment where we can study, we could have opportunity that we wouldn't be able to have in the real environment. But for the next step, I think people are really interested in, whether, human being interactions that we observe in the VR environment is reliable, not just the sensation, right? So not just the psychological responses, but also behavioral responses, whether such behavioral responses are reliable. I think that is the next step that we'll be focusing on. Before, I think we can actually talk about the practical applications of VR environment.
Okay, that's really great. So we still have 132 participants and 10 minutes to go. Anybody else wishes to ask a question?
It seems that moderators can't ask questions, or panelists can't ask questions through the digital system. So if you don't mind.
You can ask a question because you are a panelist.
Okay. Okay, I'll just ask a question the plain old way and just shout it out. So I have a question for Matteo. I love the results, and it's really interesting to kind of see your laboratory experiments versus the data from the field that we're analyzing. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure you'll do all sorts of wonderful multi-regression analysis later on, but do you have kind of simple kind of RMSE, or like what is your ability to kind of predict when a person might override? It looks like you're kind of, people might override anywhere from instantaneously to up to 2 hours later, which is kind of what we're seeing in the field. Have you tried to quantify that at all?
Not yet. That's of course a problem. To just decide when people, because as you see, it's very different. There are people that just react like 2 minutes after the ramp start and they stop the button. So like they can predict actually the change in the slightly change in the temperature. And there are others that last for like way after. So that's the point, and it's no, not yet. Sadly, not yet. So it's something that we have to investigate in. Yeah.
I guess a question for everyone and all the other panelists who are doing laboratory experiments, whether you're measuring noise level and airflow, if they're using those as kind of preliminary triggers in not actually detecting thermal comfort, but they just are uncomfortable due to airflow or noise.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't measure actually the sound, so that's but the measure it, but we have the questionnaire about it. So we still have the perception of the people, and the things that people were allowed also to press the stop button for not thermal stimuli, but we just go on until they press this button for thermal stimuli. So they can be that at the end they press for thermal, but there is also some visual visual problem. So that's also another point that we can integrate both of them. So to understand if the visual or the sound or air movement has some interaction with the actual temperature variation.
Nice.
So we measure all these things, but we stopped the experiment just when the person was uncomfortable for the temperature, because that was our aim, let's say. But we still have all this information.
Yeah, great.
Do you want to respond to that as well? Perhaps, Michael, you may repeat the question for Sarah. And
yeah, for either Sarah or Yeman, just if you're measuring kind of the sound and the airspeed associated with the HVAC system that you're using in the laboratory tests.
Well, in the chamber, we don't measure them particularly, but we actually rely on the control system to maintain these two parameters. But we don't collect the data for those two parameters.
Yeah, for us, we actually measure for each workstation the noise levels and the airflow for each like desktop, and we have included these metrics to infer the probability of thermal comfort given these parameters. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've got a specific question that just popped up from Farouk Dizizadeh, and it's for Matteo. Could you expand a bit more on your experimental conditions? For example, how long participants interact with the test bed?
Sorry, how long participants interact with the test bed, with your experiment? Okay, we had, I can perhaps maybe share maybe screen. So can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so we start the experiment. The participant entered the cell at 8 a.m. and then it has 30 minutes for acclimatization. And then after that, until lunch, there was the experimental time. So in that period, we had the experiment itself. And then after lunch, same procedure. So 30 minutes of acclimatization and then the ramp. So in this time, we got some also questionnaire. And then, for example, the stop questionnaire depends if the person actually pressed the stop button. So we got that if the person was decide, let's say, to interrupt the experiment. If not, we just continue until the end of the experiment itself. It is 180 minutes plus the 30 minutes of acclimatization, but that is a stable temperature.
Okay, and I think the question that came up now, which is the sort of question the chair should always ask at the end of the session, which came from Myra Andre, to everyone who presented today. How do you feel your research can relate to one another? Who's going to take it?
Well, let me start. I think my interest is, for example, right? So my interest in really understanding the capability of VR environment to support design engineering, especially for the building performance. But you know, many of the information that you guys presented, in my mind, I started to think whether it is ever possible for me to study in a virtual environment. What's the benefit of doing that? These kind of things. I think that's I can see those kind of connections between, you know, different studies, especially the different studies with mine.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I can resonate with what you just said. For instance, in our experiment, especially for the dynamic lighting, we would definitely benefit, for instance, by using VR environments that could change those settings, and then providing some tools to the users to provide feedback. And I'm also very interested in the possibility of using VR for assessing productivity when changing this dynamic environment, not only assessing increase in health, but also indeed productivity, which is a very important topic for us as well.
Okay, anyone else?
I'll just follow up on my kind of question for Matt. I asked because I thought our research was highly related. He's working on data in a laboratory experiment while working in field experiments. And I think everyone here is really trying to understand the relationship between the occupant and the control system. And so I'm more of a controls person than an occupant, human behavior person. So I'm really looking forward to kind of incorporating all of these into how we can really use these to help balance out the grid and increase renewables on the grid.
Okay, I've got a question now. We just came on from Yepa and Leo for you, Dr. Kane. He is wondering what kind of occupancy information did you consider in your study? Is it a binary variable like occupied or not occupied, or is it detects the number of occupants in the space?
Yep, so it does not detect the number of occupants in the space. So the Ecobee thermostats each thermostat has an occupancy sensor in it, and then people can buy external occupancy sensors to place around their house so that it can help balance the temperature throughout the house. But these are just simple passive infrared sensors, which are known to be kind of have very large errors. So we've actually engineered our analysis in a way that when we're considering the behavior part of it, we're only considering when we can detect that the person was in the space the entire time. Because the sensors are very rarely give false positives, but they very often give false negatives. And then when we're looking more at the controls, we want to be able to detect, we want to be more conservative and say, we want to say if someone will override. And for someone to override, they have to be in the space, but they might not always be in the space. So in that case, we'll only detect if a single instance of occupancy is detected. So, and then houses have anywhere between 1 and probably 5 occupancy sensors on average. Kind of the typical is probably just 1 or 2. So there's a lot of kind of dead space from these passive infrared sensors. So there's a lot of times where there's false and negatives, and we're trying to include that knowledge in our analysis.
Okay, last chance for a last question. Anybody else want to ask a question? Panelists could do that. You've got about 1 or 2 minutes if you wanted to ask each other a question, if you're willing to do that. Otherwise, we can close the session. And your offers? Okay, looks like everybody had enough from Zoom. So what I wanted to do is to just tell you something which is quite important. We still have 133 participants here. This session will now close. So the next session will be chaired by Ben Anderson, which is occupant-centric building controls. You will need to press on that session link for Zoom to come back on again so that you become part of the attendees or the presenters. But what I would say that the presenters should really start doing it now. And the rest of you, if you can wait for 5 minutes, please, so that we can start again on time, about 13:25 UK time. Okay, I hope that's clear. Session will close. Presenters, please go up straight away. The rest, please wait for 5 minutes. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you.
And Andreas Wagner said to applause to all the speakers and the audience. Can you do that live? Clap, clap. And for me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, and see you again later. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye for now.
Thank you.